It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our second and final panel of the day. And everybody who has been watching online and has been here has been very patient, and I appreciate that. I have been lucky enough to work with Nathaniel Sillin for the last 2 years while he has run Visa's financial literacy program in the United States. Nat Sillin has elevated our program here in countless ways, from partnering with 46 state governments on our popular financial football program, to creating and running the innovative Veterans Financial Coalition, which brings together consumer groups, veterans advocates, and financial experts to help newly discharged military service members navigate the confusing world of money management as they reacclimate back to civilian life. Prior to joining Visa, Nat served as the communications director for 2 members of Congress as an election campaign professional. And Nat also sits on the board of the Jumpstart Coalition for Personal Financial Literacy. My friend Nat perfectly exemplifies Visa's support for financial literacy through his boundless energy, his creative vision, and his razor-sharp intellect. Ladies and gentlemen, Nat Sillin.
Good morning. Everyone here all right? Still there or awake? What an excellent first panel. And thank you, Jason, very much for a warm and kind introduction. As Jason mentioned, my name is Nat Sillin, and I'm responsible for Visa's financial education programs here in the U.S. I'd first like to start by thanking Lucy for facilitating an excellent discussion, and for our panelists as well. As they discussed, there are many commonalities and also many differences that nations face in trying to improve the financial literacy of their citizens, particularly millennials. Now I'd like to turn to our second panel and our final panel of the day, which I'm personally very excited about. Our final conversation this morning will focus on how technology, and in particular mobile technology, can help improve financial literacy among millennials. And we'll do so through the lens of learning from those who have been successful in other industries in reaching millennials. We have a very diverse and very accomplished panel this morning, and so I'm honored to introduce them. But first, this is a topic, particularly mobile technology, when it comes to financial literacy, is one that I'm personally and particularly passionate about. We have a great dedication for at Visa. From our well-known and popular personal finance game, Financial Football, which Secretary Perez mentioned this morning, to budgeting and saving apps like Planet Prom, which helps folks budget for a popular dance that all teenagers experience, to other free apps. We continue to make significant commitments to developing mobile-based tools, applications, and games to advance financial education for those of all ages, in particular millennials. Now, I'm both honored and excited to share the stage with a distinguished, diverse group of creators, makers, and leaders who also happen to be millennials. As with the last panel, during the course of the discussion, we'll be taking questions from the audience and those following along online via Twitter using the hashtag FinLitSummit. So as the discussion goes along, please continue to tweet in your questions. I'd like to introduce our panelists and then dive right into discussion, picking up from the last panel. First, it's my honor to introduce Jake Schwartz to my right. Jake is co-founder and CEO of General Assembly, where he's responsible for guiding the organization's growth and expansion. General Assembly, as many of you may know, offers classes and workshops on the 21st century's most relevant skills, including web development, user experience design, data science, and digital marketing, to name a few. General Assembly, or GA as it's also known, established an innovative community for entrepreneurs and launched its first class back in February of 2011 with 15 students who wanted to study web development. Today, GA enrolls thousands of students every quarter at 12 campuses across 4 continents, including Australia and in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Jake can keep me in London, and Jake can keep me honest if there's other campuses I've missed.
We're actually at 14 now.
14,
so, yeah.
There you go. Their customer base also includes Fortune 1000 companies, and myself and many of my Visa colleagues have recently gone through GA's digital training, and I can say it was innovative and interesting, and certainly learned quite a bit. training managers and executives in digital concepts, technologies, and trends impacting their businesses. In only 4 years, GA has grown to employ more than 300 people and connects current students to a global community of alumni. Most recently, Jake was named to Vanity Fair's The Next Establishment list, Business Insider's Silicon Alley 100, and GA is currently #1 on Fast Company magazine's 2015 list of most innovative companies in education. Prior to founding GA, Jake worked for Associated Partners, a multi-stage private equity firm focused on telecommunications, media, and technology. He has a bachelor's from Yale and an MBA with honors from the Wharton School. So welcome, Jake.
Thank you, Nat. It's great to be here. That is the longest intro bio I've ever gotten. I wish I could have taped it for my mom.
Next up to my left, I'd like to introduce Jason Young. Jason has spent the last decade working at the intersection of technology, education, and economic empowerment. Jason is the co-founder and CEO of a company called MindBlown Labs, an education, technology, social enterprise that creates highly engaging, experiential learning tools to empower young people to make excellent financial decisions. Jason is a leading innovator, having received national recognition for his work on several occasions. Recently, he was appointed to the President's Council on Financial Capability for Young Americans, where he is working to form policy recommendations on how the federal government can help improve millennials' financial capability. Jason's also the co-founder and president of the Hidden Genius Project, a nonprofit that trains underserved black male youth in technology creation and entrepreneurship. Prior to founding these organizations, he was part of the founding team of WicInvest. He also worked at Merrill Lynch as a senior specialist. Jason earned a BA in economics from Harvard University.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And lastly, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Gerrit Lansing. Gerrit is the co-founder and CEO of REVV, an online donation platform focused on right-leaning campaigns and causes. Prior to founding REVV, Gerrit was the digital director of the National Republican Congressional Committee, where he engineered the transformation of House Republicans' digital strategy, helping win the largest majority in the House since the 1920s. During his time leading House Republicans' digital campaign strategy, Gerrit built one of the largest and most advanced digital operations in Washington, D.C. He advocated for and enacted a fundamental shift in how the Republican Party approached and leveraged cutting-edge digital tools to target voters, reach millennials, and with new levels of specificity, and he boosted online fundraising by over 500%. Before leaving Capitol Hill to lead the party's digital campaign strategy, he worked as a press secretary for Congressman Peter Roskam, Illinois native, and later worked as press secretary for the House Budget Committee under Chairman Paul Ryan. Gerrit received a bachelor's in classical languages from the University of the South. He's a Chicago native and a passionate Blackhawks fan. So welcome, Gerrit.
Thanks, Nat.
So I'd like to begin by diving right in and picking up where our last panel left off. And with that, I'd like to turn to Jason Young. Jason, why did MindBlown Labs choose to make a mobile game to combat financial literacy, or why choose a mobile game platform as your primary means for educating folks when it comes to financial literacy?
Well, I think the answer to this question is very similar to some of the things that we've heard already, which is that when you think of millennials, and a lot of our work to date has been focused within the United States, so I should lead by saying that. But when you think of millennials, particularly in the US, and especially when you think of younger students, so one, there's the issue of smartphone penetration. So roughly about, call it 80 to 90% of American teens have smart devices. And about 86% of young adults under about 35 also have smart devices. And so that's huge, but I think the important thing to understand is that when we talk about these devices, these are not just things that they use, they're actually a way of life. And so smartphones are really how millennials are accessing and interacting with the world. And so it makes sense that if you wanted to reach them, that you would want to reach them where they are, so first and foremost. And when you think about games, well, games are natural learning systems. They bring a couple of, I say, three main things that are hard to find in other places. So the first is just accessibility. So games are extremely accessible. We talked about this idea of stigma and shame associated with not knowing things. Games remove that because games come automatically with a set of rules that you have to learn anytime you engage with them. And moreover, they're something that millennials are very familiar with. 97% of millennials play games. And so very accessible, there's no stigma associated with it. It's a very easy way to communicate a new set of information, facts. But then beyond that, you have engagement. So engagement is incredibly important to learning. So engagement is necessary for something called deep understanding. Deep understanding means you go beyond merely having rote memorization to being able to apply knowledge and develop real skills. That can't happen without engagement. Games are among the most engaging mediums out there. And so you have accessibility, you have engagement, and then I would say one of the other things we're really interested in is actually assessment. So how do you know if people are actually learning? And games are really powerful because today's modern games platforms, whether they're online, or I should say web-based or mobile, allow you to collect tons of data. Now, sometimes this data is used for evil. So for instance, I could, manipulate you using, game mechanics into spending $1,000, for a virtual good. But if you think about what goes into making that happen, people are basically studying the game behaviors of the players over extended periods of time. They're understanding their emotional state. They're understanding how to manipulate that behavior. And so if you think about that power when used from an educational standpoint, it is absolutely huge. And so there are a lot of other things I could say about games, but I don't want to take up the whole panel.
I'd like to cue on that and shift to Jake. Jake, you've obviously been very successful in developing a model to teach important 21st century skills to folks of all ages, including millennials. And I'm sure along the way, in development of General Assembly's programs, there must be some consideration of games and gamification as a consideration whether that was a tactic or tool to teach some of those skills. And so that's my first part of my question. And my second part of my question is, share any thoughts on that. And the second part of the question is, what advice or insights do you have for folks in the financial literacy space trying to teach personal finance and financial education in a way that's compelling and engaging to folks based on your experiences developing the offerings of General Assembly?
Okay, I'll try to keep track of
And
those questions.
I can go back and remind you, too, of the second part.
It's okay. The first question is really like games, gamification, that kind of stuff. And, sure. I would say we don't really think about it in that way, other than we are constantly iterating on our curriculum. And what we've seen time and time again, that the higher you get way higher engagement rates, higher NPS, which you should probably assume means more learning with more relevance in your case studies and your topic areas. That's true for when you're educating executives, when you're educating 25-year-olds, and it's probably even more true when you're educating 12-year-olds, right? Who, by the way, are not millennials. They're going to be something else. They're going to be even scarier, I think, right? So, the way, we tend to think about this generation, and I mean, why GA was really started and why we're so passionate about what we do is, we sort of have a belief that in this country, while liberal arts has sort of been the core of the way we view education and we have sort of established our educational infrastructure, those institutions are not very capable of giving students the skills they need to be competitive in the 21st century. And it's really skills is the underlying word because that's what employers are looking for. Whether it's knowing, web development or data science or basic comfort with an income statement or a balance sheet, these are the things that allow people to not only manage their own finances, which is sort of a big topic here, but also have an economic life. And if you sort of look at just, one of the things these millennials are facing is a massive, massive, massive pile of student debt, right? They have all been exposed to lots of statements and lots of understanding of the time value of money, just in the wrong direction, right? They are struggling to find a way to, earn their economic way through the world. They were essentially told by society, go into debt, by the credit cards, go into debt by the educational institutions, and by de facto our government. You should trust the experts when it comes to financial management. And all of those things kind of turned out to be total BS, right? And so I think when we're talking about financial education, what we really need to be thinking about is the context of this generation's financial lives. And by the way, when we talk about millennials, we're talking about people between the ages of 22 and 35. And that ranges everywhere from people who are very rich and have a graduate degree, although most of them are in debt, all the way down to people who are completely underbanked. So we have to keep in mind that all we're really talking about is people who, I like to say, had an email address in high school. That's sort of the generational divide. And so from my perspective, that we are dealing with an entirely sort of disillusioned, cynical, and really sort of exploited generation of people. And what we really all have to think about is how do we increase the literacy of that population, but how do we earn back their trust? Right? Because there's no way that anyone's going to listen to you if they don't really believe in your brand, believe in your message, or think that it has any relevance to their current economic circumstances. And so, to me, the agenda is a way more about do we want as a society to increase the savings rate? Do we want to decrease the consumer indebtedness, right? I mean, there are some economists who would disagree with that, right? Do we want to be able to sell more financial products to this generation? That's an interesting goal, right? I'm sure a lot of the banks would say yes. Maybe our economy depends on it. We don't really know. Do we want to encourage home ownership? Or was home ownership a bad idea, right? I mean, I think a lot of what we think of as financial literacy, some of it is totally basic common sense that should be taught in grade school all the way up, and some of it is conventional wisdom that I'm not even sure is correct.
And to that end, I mean, some of the basics, and a lot of what, in large part, for many folks, financial literacy is the basics. It's the teaching of budgeting and saving, and we had this interesting, and so that's a function of that's a necessity, right? There's just a lot of larger concepts and discussions and questions that should need to be tackled by the policy community and by culture and society, but it's functionally, there's still the importance of being able to teach and have people be literate in the sense of how to balance a checkbook and how to manage their personal finances and take control.
When was the last? I can't remember the last time I actually wrote a physical check.
Or it's equivalent of online though, but being able to know your. So we had this really fascinating discussion last night, and it was about the notion that teaching personal finance is important, but can be and is commonly accepted as boring or not exciting. And there was amongst this group, and there was a rejection of that notion that it was boring. And Jason had a very interesting analogy. I don't know if you want to share your analogy.
So I actually have forgotten my analogy.
Oh, okay. So the analogy was, and I'll refresh your memory. The analogy was would you want to be an astronaut? Would being an astronaut be interesting to you, right? The idea of being an astronaut, is that something that's exciting? And yes, but would you want to be an astronaut if you weren't taught, you weren't discussed and taught about landing on the moon or going into space, but the question was framed as, do you want to learn how to do all the basic rudimentary skills that's required to become an astronaut? Do you want to do, that's all you were taught was about the training, not about the end goal of being an empowered, capable, independent, person with your finances, but about, learning this particular skill, and that's all you talk about. And so it's an interesting from a construct standpoint of is there an issue with the way in which particularly in approaching millennials whose trust, may need to be regained, the way in which we present the teaching of personal finance.
Well, and by the way, if you're 23, right, we're talking about teaching in a very different way than what MindBlown Labs is really working on, right? So let's really understand, the people, when we talk about schools, we're not talking about millennials. When we're talking about millennials, we're talking about people who are starting their financial lives for real. They have jobs.
Could I interject there? Because I think the millennial definition is a little bit wider, and I think that you're bringing up a good point, which is that not all millennials are the same. because there's still millennials who are in school and who are younger, and those millennials are different from the young adults.
One thing that
you're talking about.
does overarch a lot of the millennials, and to add on to your astronaut analogy, is vast majorities of them, for years and years, studies have shown want to be entrepreneurs and own their own business. And so if you carry on that analogy, I think one way to get to them is to say, if you want to own your own business, you want to be an entrepreneur, these are the things you got to know. And you don't have to present it in a dry way, but it's like the goal is already out there that they want to be an entrepreneur. They want to do their own business. And today, the coolest people are the Zuckerbergs and the Steve Jobs of the world who've done that. And that might be a way to get into them. And also, it bridges some of the a 22-year-old is very different from a 35-year-old, like you were just mentioning, but that bridges some of those gaps.
So,
I'm sorry.
Oh no! So one of the points of our discussion this morning is really focused on how to reach millennials and inform from folks who have been successful in doing so in different industries how to reach those working in the financial literacy community can look at new approaches to reach them. And I'd like to ask Gerrit a question. From your experience in the political and the advocacy world, you've done a lot of cutting edge things from the digital perspective in targeting and reaching specific audiences with specific messages. Do you have any insights or any particular tips to share with those in the room and those watching via the webcast about how to reach the audience, different audiences, particularly millennials, and through the way in which they consume information, and in large part mobile?
Yeah, in politics, you've got a different and really more difficult problem because there's a lot of other noise out there, right? So there's an entire media empire. The left has their own empire, the right has theirs. So there's a ton of noise out there always talking about the policies and the candidates that you want to educate voters about. And so the trick becomes getting the right message to the right voter at the right time, which involves a whole content creation cycle and a delivery strategy, which involves ads and also content. And so one of the things we focus very heavily on is finding the right voters through the voter file, and then finding them online through various strategies. So a couple of things we did last cycle. And it doesn't perfectly apply to, for instance, how you're doing to how to get people to adopt your app, but in commuter districts, right? So that are expensive TV districts. So the suburbs of Chicago, the suburbs of New York City, prohibitively expensive to buy TV there, to buy broadcast TV advertising, and so you're not going to buy it. Millions of dollars a week to do it. And so you also have people coming in and out of the city, and so you need to find their mobile ID, you need to make sure that they're the right voter you want to find, and then you need to get them the right message. So that's something that we spend a lot of time, and it's a difficult trick to pull off. That was one question I have for Jason is, how do you make sure you're getting the app into the right hands? People who are millennials who are already interested in financial literacy, let's say, or games, are going to find your app maybe. And so, how do you make sure it's the people who aren't interested and are going to be therefore worse, affected the worst by not having any literacy about it?
So I'll answer that question. Then I would like to return to some of the points that Jake raised, because I think some of them were really, really good. So from our perspective, we actually distribute through partnerships. Okay. So we kind of know, pretty well where our app is going. And while it is available more broadly to the general public, we're pretty targeted. But to be frank, when you look at kind of financial literacy, financial capability in this country, depending on the measure you use, anywhere from 60% to 95%, and I tend to be more on the 95% side of young people are financially illiterate. So even the ones who are interested, in fact, we're known in this country for believing that we're more financially literate than we actually are, particularly when we're younger. But Jake, I think you touched upon 3 points: relevance, skill, and trust, which I think are really, really huge. And I think that when you're talking about millennials, and I think this is anyone, but particularly millennials, you really have to take into account the context in which they're operating. And so when you talk about delivering this type of education, realize that they have come of age in a digital world. Realize that if you're creating digital tools in particular, to reach them, then those tools should meet the same standards of all of the other tools that are commercially available, which may have nothing to do with education, but which kind of set the standard for quality and how young people think about reacting to the world. So I think that's one big thing. I think skill, financial capability, so financial literacy is knowledge, but really we want financial capability, people actually making better decisions and managing their money better. It's a skill. And so when you think about skills, if we're talking about math, there's no expectation that you would take a one-semester course at some point and suddenly you would know basic arithmetic, algebra, calculus, geometry. But we seem to have this idea that tends to be the case around financial capability, which really what you need is ongoing education that is delivered in a timely manner, dependent on stages in life. And so even when you look at curriculum, there's like, oh, let's teach them about mortgages, let's teach them about credit cards, let's teach them about credit scores, let's teach them about budgeting, let's teach them about investing and retirement. And by the way, let's do that in between 4 weeks to 12 weeks. And that's not really feasible. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have these courses. I'm saying what we need is a lot more, and it needs to be done at a much higher level of quality and in a much better way. And then I think trust. So some of the stats that I've seen, some from surveys done by Viacom of all places, but basically about 71% of young adults, so that's one half of the millennial population, if you will, basically would rather go to the dentist than go to the bank. And so you compound that when you go even younger, and so about 83% of American teens believe that banks mainly exist to steal their money through hidden fees. So when you talk about financial literacy and a willingness to engage, I think the trust piece is actually pretty huge, and that is not limited to banks. It actually extends to other financial services. So
let me take on that. Let me take a question from the audience, and it is for all three of you, and it relates specifically to that. And Sheila in the audience asks, how do we measure engagement and behavior changes of millennials that use financial literacy apps? And I would like to abbreviate the question in some way and just say, how do you measure engagement and behavior changes for folks who attend and participate in GA substantively? And then, obviously from your respective industries, and Jason, you could probably speak from a financial literacy perspective, but I'd love to get your input, Jake, on how are you all measuring engagement and behavior changes?
Well, I mean, there's actually a pretty established set of best practices around, like, are people using your thing? Do they like using your thing? Are they telling other people about your thing, right? Like, it's sort of like, it's pretty basic, sure. Right? And I think, there's a lot of people love to call out these apps, right? And I think one of the biggest challenges with a lot of these apps at the engagement level, both in terms of absolute usage, but also in terms of usage among users, is relatively low, right? Like, people love to throw out Mint, right, as sort of the killer example. I mean, Mint got started to basically be lead gen for credit card companies, which is sort of funny. And I don't know a single person who uses that, right? And every couple of years I see somebody come out with another one of these apps. And I think just over and over again what we've seen is the amount of work it takes to get all your data in there relative to the amount of useful utility and insights you actually get out of that. And by the way, from the app perspective, how do you actually monetize that relationship? These are all pretty tough issues. And so I think the data it's just basic data. Like, do people actually use your thing? Do they use it when they've downloaded it, and are they happy about it?
Do you think apps like Venmo and PayPal should be providing some sort of side option that teaches people about savings, or you can do direct savings, and then therefore you've got the platform already built out, engagement is high, it's something you have to go to?
I think if they have, if there's an incentive for them to do that, right? Like if Venmo and PayPal are more interested in having banking services, I mean, I would say that actually I think there's a massive opportunity for some company to be the trustworthy banking brand for this generation. Like, I think this is a multi-billion dollar entrepreneurial opportunity for somebody. You could say that one of the existing sort of cooler financial services brands like a PayPal or
There's Robinhood. There's
Square.
that no-fee financial investment company. Did you ever
right.
read that?
But there's a lot of those, like a lot of people are targeting the investment thing, but that's like a tiny, tiny, tiny little slice, right? That's just like, that's people. I mean, that's people of our generation who have enough money to invest in stocks, right? And that's kind of, we're not talking about a lot of people, right, relative to the things. I'm talking about a massive, massive consumer financial services opportunity because the level of trust with brands is so low, right? And I think that. And if you could center that brand around financial literacy, around transparency, around having your own fiduciary interest at heart, like you could just make a killing.
Yeah.
Jason, do you have any thoughts, particularly on the financial literacy aspect of it?
Sure, and I'll just say that is a huge opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, we're looking at a couple things. So going back to this idea of games and gathering data, one of the things we're doing is we're implementing a behavioral assessment engine that will actually measure learning outcomes based on behaviors in the game over time. And I think the kind of power of that is rather than measuring just a point in time or just doing multiple choice, we would be able to present players with different scenarios which really require them to have knowledge and be able to apply knowledge in different ways in order to successfully complete those scenarios. And so I think it's a much more powerful form of assessment, which I'm very excited about. And there's other things that are happening. So there's an organization called Glass Lab, which we're looking to work with and do some of this work. And they are doing this, in different parts of gaming outside of financial literacy. In addition to that, we're actually doing a randomized control trial study to essentially validate not only our game, but the behavioral assessment engine, providing account access and seeing how that changes behavior in real life. And the idea there is to actually have rigorous research that supports actual behavior change, in addition to changes in attitudes, as well as changes in knowledge. More generally, I think that our space, and particularly, suffers from both a lack of engagement and a lack of assessment. And there are multiple reasons for that. Part of that has to do with funding to propel that assessment. But part of it is, frankly, there's a lot of stuff out there that's not particularly engaging. So I don't know that a lot of players would necessarily be running to that assessment if it was available.
Gerrit, your company that you've recently founded is an online donation platform trying to revolutionize the way in which donations are made in that process.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what goes, from your perspective in your industry, what goes into trying to connect with millennials, particularly from a mobile platform standpoint?
I mean, honestly, when I think about just mobile design, I mean, millennials will over-index for the usage because they all have smartphones, but really for anyone who uses it, I think of some very bread and butter issues. Jake was talking about like trust in institutions. I think on the internet, and especially when it comes to financial things on the internet, like payment services or apps like Venmo or donation platforms, design equals trust. And so it's an really important thing to have the design be absolutely fantastic. And you see so many apps and companies and websites that are just bad design, and so it's inherently sort of not trustworthy. The other thing is, another really bread and butter thing we talk about all the time, but it's non-mobile friendly stuff, non-mobile friendly websites. Google now finally is going to rank higher on organic results, mobile-friendly websites, which is going to help sort of push that design phase. But you see a lot of companies' emails and websites that don't work on mobile. It's game over. You can't even read it. So those are some really bread and butter, very, very basic stuff that a lot of people get wrong. The design and just making sure that it actually works on mobile. That's what I think about when I approach that.
Thank you. So Jake, GA obviously started off with offering in-person classes and training, and now you're utilizing the technology that you're teaching, and you've transferred and to expand to a much larger audience, reaching them digitally. and making it accessible via online classes. What have you guys learned about, and what insights can you share, building on Gerrit's comments about how to reach millennials, and also particularly how to reach folks online and perhaps even mobile, and hear what you all are, the considerations at GA about mobile?
Yeah, I would say that the key insight is like, mobile is now it's the same thing. Most people use this as their computer. In fact, I just got this new iPhone that's like really big, and I was like, all of a sudden I was like, oh, like I can even do my email on this. Like, it's not like there's no difference between a mobile and your computer for most people now in how they behave. The second thing is when you're dealing with education, right? What you want is engagement, and the way you get engagement is through a bunch of stuff that you sort of learn over time. Gamification, making it relevant, these are one thing. The other thing we've learned, have really, really short bits of content, right? Like, when we started, we would do like a 30-minute talk by some person, right? And then we started to experiment breaking that up into little 2-minute sections, and the engagement is so much higher, the retention is so much higher, and that's pretty valuable and really important. The second thing I would say is that, and this is like so obvious but kind of disappointing, but I guess it's the thing, is like when we started, we really, we have a whole database and a community of subject matter experts that teach a lot of our classes offline. It's a big, important part of what we do. But we've found for certain things in an online context, we've done A/B tests where we've hired actors to deliver the same lectures that the geeky subject matter expert would have otherwise done.
Like there's the commercial where the guy who's the DJ, I don't know if anybody's seen it, and pretends to be a financial advisor and said, would you trust this guy?
Right, no, and the funny thing is it works so much better, right? Like,
What, for the actor to do it?
What?
For the actor?
The actor is way more compelling online, right? Is that simple communication and media skills do matter for this stuff. And so, that actually creates a real dilemma for us because we care so much about authenticity. We care so much about being taught by practitioners, and yet we also want people to be engaged and pay attention. And so we've had to find really innovative balances, and we were sort of training our subject matter experts more and, doing stuff like that. But it does really tell you that you have to optimize for engagement, right? You have to. And I think what MindBlown Labs is doing is amazing because, it is true. These games are super addictive. I'm constantly addicted to one on here. And half of the games are basically like building your own little empire or like managing a portfolio, optimizing your resource allocation among different rates of return and time allocation and things like that. These are all basically business concepts, and I love the idea of turning it into something which is a little more explicit so people can understand, life is kind of a game too. I didn't mean it to come out like that, but it kind of is, right?
You have any reactions or thoughts to that?
I generally don't like to agree with people too much, but I agree with that.
Okay.
You can agree with me all you want. Yeah.
I think there's a huge point there, which is, and I made it a little bit earlier, which is games are natural learning systems. They're teaching you sets of rules. A lot of games are already, if you think about Angry Birds and the fact that you can use that to teach math, right? And I think that is huge, but I think going back to this bigger point about engagement, because everybody talks about engagement, right? And everybody says, oh yes, people should be engaged, right? But I don't think that people fully understand, and maybe all the people in this room do, but I think many people do not fully understand the true importance of engagement, and that learning generally does not happen without engagement, and significant learning cannot happen without engagement. And when you look at some of the studies that are out there, and there's like 30 years of research that kind of supports this, is that, first of all, experiential learning, which tends to be very engaging, can more than double the amount of learning that is obtained when compared to, say, just like straight lecture-based learning. And that doesn't just mean games, but that does mean engagement and having folks have the opportunity to apply what they're learning as they're learning it. So I think that's a really important point. And just more generally, when you think about the power of engagement, like there are tons of studies that show that engagement improves, I shouldn't say tons, but there's studies that show that engagements improve academic achievement. And even Gallup has, kind of something out there that shows that every 1% increase in engagement increases academic achievement by 6%. And so when you look at these things, I think that it's the exact opposite of what's happening in many classrooms. And when you think about like the best teachers, right? So really, really good teachers, they have mastered that engagement piece. And so that's what I think about that.
Interesting. So when you all are talking to your colleagues, and in the topic of personal financial management or managing your finances comes up, or even what you're banking, at a very basic level, do you discuss as being the most innovative or interesting thing going on out there right now from where you sit? And I'd love to have everyone answer the question. I mean, what it could be an app, it could be an approach. What's actually innovative and interesting and been potentially disruptive in a positive way that you're seeing from where you sit? Maybe Gerrit, I'd be happy to start with you.
So the question, innovative sort of financial app or literacy?
Yeah, financial app or process or something that you're seeing when it comes to personal financial management or education as a function of that, teaching basic financial literacy, or even in which the way you're managing your money or your financial institution is trying to encourage you to take control. What do you see in talking to your colleagues as being actually interesting and innovative from a creator standpoint, from an entrepreneur standpoint?
Well, frankly, I mean, until I met Jason last night, I didn't know about MindBlown Labs. I'm going to download it today, but I hadn't seen a lot before that. I do think that the ease of, it's not really related to financial literacy, but I think it informs people probably about how much money they're spending. And I asked Jake earlier, I think there's an opportunity for a company like Venmo to sort of get into that saving space, whatever that sort of bubble is, because Venmo is the best payment app I've ever seen in my life, and it's so easy to transfer between people, and that's with phones and this generation, I think sort of person-to-person business, and almost obviously it goes through Venmo to process, but it feels much more one-to-one. And it's sort of a more powerful thing to be able to give money more easily between people. So I think that's probably the coolest thing I've seen out there.
Jason, your thoughts?
Well, I'll start off by saying there needs to frankly be a lot more. I would say that if we look, and there's also a divide. So there's more happening for young adults than there are for folks who are in, say, like high school and below. And so at the in the young adult space, I think it's really interesting because you can actually transact much more with real money. And so you have things like Level Money, you have things like Simple, which are really kind of focused on interface and kind of actual behavior change, but also interacting with the daily transactions that people make. So I think those are pretty interesting. I think Tuition.io is interesting because they're at least trying to address the student loan piece. But I like to see some things that go a little bit further that actually, tie into payments themselves. I would say in the young adult space, there's only very few players that the high school space and below, there's only a very few players that I think are really interesting. And I would say I do think that we have one of the most innovative solutions, and I'm not just saying that. I actually think it's true. But in addition to that, I think, for instance, of MoneyThink, I think they're doing some interesting stuff. This is not mobile per se, but I look at the Girl Scouts. So they're building a platform called Digital Cookie, and what's really interesting there is they're tying in entrepreneurship, actual revenue streams coming from the cookie sales, which is a huge business, with the financial literacy education. And so that's very nascent, and it certainly has a ways to go as you do the MoneyThink app, and frankly, we're learning as we go as well. But those are some things that I think are pretty innovative.
I agree. I think Venmo's a big deal just because people are actually using it, right? It's not, I mean, there were a lot of people trying to do that. They kind of won by getting bought by PayPal, and people are using it. And
Which meets your
that
metrics.
that means it's important. I also think I'm way less, I think technology is such a small piece of what is going to be innovation and disruption in financial services. I think it's an enabling piece of it. And really it's about just getting to rebuild it from scratch, whereas like, Bank of America has 30 years of mainframes they've got to deal with. So the companies I'm really excited about right now are ones that are sort of starting to take a piece of the financial services infrastructure and rebuilding the whole thing, right? Like it's literally they're changing the value proposition, they're changing their pools of capital, they're changing how they talk to their customers. So we have a close relationship with a company called Earnest, which just raised a Series A round. They have a great approach to this. Max Levchin has a company called Affirm that will be launching publicly pretty soon. I think it's an interesting play and sort of a new approach to consumer lending. But again, I think everybody's got their approach, but they're all trying to get to the big prize, which is to be this brand. I think SoFi, Lending Club, these Common Bond, these are companies who are, doing student loan refinancing, but again, using that as a wedge into the place of like, how do we be the next generation of bank? I think, nobody has tackled insurance in any meaningful way. I think there's a huge opportunity in somebody just cleaning up the mess that is these employer 401k plans where, I'll tell you, when people came and pitched me on wanting to operate that for us, I was just aghast at like, just how lame they were and how like in the best interest of the employees that these plans were. I think there's a huge opportunity. I think Jamie Dimon just said this at a conference where he was like, Silicon Valley's coming for us. He's the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. And I think it's really true, and I think it's only getting started. And I think there's so many opportunities. Almost every segment, every business opportunity in financial services can be reinvented. And like everything that's being reinvented for millennials, it's all about authenticity, transparency, a clear value proposition, and reaching them where they are. And I think there's just gazillions of cool ideas that will be coming.
So that seems particularly for this audience and both folks in academia and nonprofits and policymakers and people in business who are focused on financial literacy. That seems very informative, right? And translates well in terms of advice of where things are moving. I'd like to take a Twitter question. I haven't done so yet, so it'll shift the discussion a little bit. But it's open for anyone. And Pamela Liebfried, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, she's asking a broad question. It says, "What's the number one financial literacy lesson I should make sure my about to graduate college nephew knows to help him succeed?" And you can take a liberal approach to that with what's the number one lesson, in particular for personal finance, that Pamela's about to graduate college nephew should know. Personal experience is
I'd say personal experience, having just started a company and don't have a paycheck for the last 4 months, I would have, if you get a job after college, do your best, figure out your burn rate, what is your monthly spending, and then build up like a 6-month sort of backstop to that. I think my parents sort of told me about, always try to have like 2 or 3 months, but if they hadn't told me, no, I never would have thought about that. So I think that's good advice.
Excellent.
Very basic, but
it's good. Jason?
I would say that, unfortunately, there's so many lessons that actually are pretty critically important, whether it's dealing with student loans or, basic budgeting and knowing your burn rate. And so probably the single most important thing for her nephew to know is to understand that there are probably a lot of things that he doesn't know, and to very quickly find folks who can give him insight, and to very quickly learn how to get information. And I think this is a great point, which is he's just graduating from college, but this kind of happens over and over again. which is that you move to another stage, there's a lot of information that you don't have that you needed yesterday. And so I would say that would actually be probably the biggest thing.
Okay, excellent.
I would probably say that while it's so easy and tempting to see the world of finance and financial stuff as this sort of world of wizards and complicated machinery, it's actually pretty simple. And that it's sort of up to you and up to everyone to own that and truly try to understand how that machinery works.
I mean, on that note, before you founded General Assembly, one of your previous roles was you worked at an investment management firm.
Mm-hmm.
How did your experience there inform your passion for education? How did it go from being interested in investment management and working in a firm and finance to having a passion, as we've discussed and you've shared, for education?
Well, it was actually kind of an evolution, because I grew up on a farm in Oregon until I was like 8, right? And I moved in the suburbs. And then I was sort of lucky enough to get to go to Yale for undergrad. And being, from essentially the provinces going to Yale, I assumed I was basically set for life. So, I majored in American studies. I did a lot of really fun things. I didn't worry about getting a job at all. I figured, and really it was under this faulty assumption that just because the degree was in Latin, it was this, Harry Potter spell. It was just gonna magically open any door that I wanted it to. And so I got out into the world, and it was I got kind of the shit beaten out of me for a while, right? And I think a lot of people can relate to that. And I ended up, I had sort of missed that on-ramp that I saw some of my friends doing, going into consulting or investment banking, where it was they were all taken care of, and I was, at the time, super envious of them. And so I started, I hustled my way into an investment management job and kind of really worked my way up. And then actually it was really through the process of, I did the CFA, and I sort of taught myself, the CFA, and I passed all the 3 levels. The Chartered Financial Analyst, which is a great program, but I just kept thinking this was the first time I was really all of a sudden I was super into statistics. I understood accounting, I understood finance, and I actually thought it was all really cool, right? I was this is awesome. Why didn't anyone sort of insist that I learn this earlier? This is incredibly empowering stuff. And so I ended up, going to business school later on for a bunch of other reasons. But I think that idea of the CFA, that experience after undergrad, and really my experience at business school, all sort of made me think that there was this really confusing mismatch of what we thought education was supposed to do and what it actually did, and what people needed. And that is sort of what led to General Assembly.
Interesting. So bring it back to financial literacy. The last panel talked about, and some of our panelists mentioned, the idea that millennials have an impatience for change, and also that obviously, very much the way millennials interface, and love to get your reactions on this, through mobile is when they want, where they want, and how they want it, which relates to this impatience for change. And I'd love to get your perspective on, particularly as it relates to trying to increase basic education about personal finance in some of the work that you do, Jason, and also in the way in which you connect, Gerrit, with the audiences you try to reach. Your reactions to and thoughts about this focal point that millennials have an impatience for change, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, and also that to reach them and to engage them, you must do it where they want, when they want, and how that informs what you're doing. I'd love to get your reactions on that. And you can reject the premise if you so choose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit tricky, because I think that millennials are certainly impatient. And I think that there's certainly expectations around communication and the format of that communication, when it happens, how it happens. And so I do think that absolutely needs to be taken into account. I think that if you are talking about, and I think it also depends on the context. So if you're talking about older millennials who, for instance, are not within an educational, kind of a formal educational context, then I think that becomes even more important. If you're talking about, say, students who are still in high school, well, I think that while that premise is not totally inaccurate, I think it's also important to understand that nobody gets exactly what they want when they want. And so it's a kind of a balance between that, which is that I think the education needs to be delivered in a format, and yes, timing should be taken into account, medium should be taken into account, At the flip side is if I think about some of the most effective teachers, and I'll go back to that. One of the things that they do is they get sometimes students who don't particularly want to learn at that particular time to learn at that particular time. And so I think, yes, but don't go too far, because then you'll end up with the opposite problem, which is everything is not going to be fun and games. As much as we talk about engagement, everything is not going to be like super fun. And I'm sure that studying for the CFA was not particularly.
Oh, it was the worst.
Yeah. And
every weekend, during the spring, no less. It was terrible.
And so if you're dealing with particularly millennials on the younger end, you also have to understand that part of the goal of education and part of the goal of training is also to build in resiliency, and also to prepare them for the real world. So in the real world, you don't get everything you want whenever you want. On the other hand, in the real world, there are definitely some things that you do get when you want them, how you want them. And so understanding that balance as it applies to education is actually pretty important. So I hope what I said wasn't super confusing, but I do think that you need a balance.
Gerrit, I'd love to get your thoughts from where you sit in your industry as well, and the work you do from an advocacy standpoint, engaging folks.
I mean, I think a lot of people pay lip service to the, just a very general comment here, but a lot of people pay lip service to the idea that everyone's on mobile and this is how the world works. But, literally, with a tap of a few buttons, food comes to you, a car comes to you, you can check in for your flight, you can buy a ticket to your flight. And I think companies and society and the government certainly sort of pay lip service. Everyone sort of knows that. But until they sort of adapt, and I mean, Jake's talking about some of the insurance, banking possibilities. The industries that do that are really going to get disrupted because they don't actually treat it and understand that this is a generation and the world comes to them in the palm of their hand. So they want things now, and they want things that work on their phone. So I think, again, it's easy to pay lip service to that, but it really takes a structural mind change to reorient your organization around what that means and what your product is and when you're delivering it and how. And that's difficult for a lot of big old companies to do, and certainly big bureaucracies like the government as well. So,
any additional thoughts to add on that topic?
I'm good.
Okay, fair enough. So with that, I think what I'd love to do is begin to wrap things up. I mean, I hope this has been an informative and instructive discussion from really leaders in a number of different industries who are working with millennials and who are millennials, focusing on how to engage from a digital perspective. And perhaps the best way to close would be just to go down the line here and start with Jake. Any closing thoughts you have, obviously in the context of the discussion, both about what General Assembly is doing to reach millennials that may inform some of the folks in the room, or provide closing thoughts for people to walk away with.
I think it's pretty easy. It's those three words I keep using, right? Or it's transparency, authenticity, and relevancy, right? Or relevance. Then you lose that thing. But I think that is what it's all about, right? And it's not. I honestly don't think. I think people spill a lot of ink talking about millennials as this totally different sea of people. They're not. It's a fluid thing. They just happen to be young. We were all young once. They came of age in a different context than some of us came of age, right? So you have to think about that. And then I think more importantly is that you have to be empathetic to their context and try to find a way to reach them in that way. That's the way that you will succeed in this space.
Excellent. Jason, what are your thoughts, particularly from a company who is engaged in the education of young folks, millennials, on financial literacy, using a variety of tools, mobile, digital? I'd love to get your closing thoughts as well.
So I would just start off with, in many cases, young people, particularly millennials, do actually want to learn about this stuff. And I do think it's important that, we speak about this stuff in a way that is, once again, empathetic to their context. I think that technology is an incredibly powerful tool. It is something that we would be foolish to ignore, particularly mobile gaming, but that understanding that technology is not the full answer. I firmly believe that people make the world go round. And that, if you're talking about, whether you're talking about financial education, whether you're talking about, helping, young adults to make better financial decisions, there is and there remains a place for people, particularly trusted resources, to play a part. And I think that the opportunity is to understand the things that technology can do really, really well. Technology is at its heart, in many cases, a medium for communication. That's what a game is. It's communicating. That's what, if we talk about what really well-designed apps, they're communicating. Yes, they may be transacting, they may be doing other things, but communication is at the heart of that. So to the extent that technology can be used to not only provide initial engagement, but to facilitate communication, I think that it is incredibly powerful, but we should not forget about the people.
That's great. Thank you. Gerrit, any closing thoughts?
I think my experience in politics in DC tells me that broadly speaking, there's really two ways for things to change or institutions to change. And that's one, there's a massive grassroots uproar that sort of demands and moves change, or a leader or a group of leaders who implement change and leads a group or a people to somewhere where they need to be. Unfortunately, for this conversation, I do not see a groundswell grassroots movement in America or the world in the near future for financial literacy. I think there's probably other things that are on the top of people's list. And so, therefore, your second option for how to change things is going to be you need leaders to do that. And so that's elected leaders and companies and institutions that we all trust. And so I think it's upon groups like Visa and the Fed and groups like that to move leaders to take a more active role in this and try to enact change.
Great. And with that, I'd like to close. I'd like to thank, first of all, our audience for listening intently and patiently. And I thank our panelists very much for the informative remarks. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to my colleague, Jason Alderman, to close this morning's session.
Well, thank you, Nat and panel. That was terrific. I'm really grateful. What a great way to wrap up the day. Thank you to everyone here in Chicago who has stayed for all of this. We're grateful. It's a sign of your dedication. And thank you to everyone watching online. The summit will be available for viewing online later today. And with that, we have concluded the 9th Annual Financial Literacy Summit. Thank you all very much.